The moment when everything changes does not come with trumpets or promises of enlightenment. It arrives like a pause between two thoughts. A simple gaze rests upon what is, and suddenly the world loses its boundaries. No external achievement can touch this clarity. The body still breathes, time still flows, but something within stops running along with it. What once was a search reveals itself as distraction. What once was a path reveals itself as a labyrinth built by the mind itself. To truly see is to realize that nothing was ever hidden, only veiled by the urgency to find. In that moment, the search dissolves, and the observer awakens to the reality that had always awaited in silence. There is a kind of weariness that does not come from the body. It cannot be cured with sleep, nor with vacations, nor with new goals. It is the exhaustion of chasing something that never allows itself to be reached. Many call it a spiritual quest, others call it personal growth, and some, more honest, simply call it restlessness. Whatever the name, the movement is the same, projecting the meaning of existence outward, as if the truth were always one step ahead. And yet, the more one runs, the further it seems. It is a paradox. The more man searches, the more he unconsciously confirms the absence of what he seeks. This exhaustion is as old as consciousness itself. It begins subtly, like a breath crossing the chest, the feeling that something essential is missing. Then the human being begins a pilgrimage. He searches in sacred books, in traditions, in masters, in loves, in possessions. He believes there is a hidden key somewhere in the world, and when one door opens, another soon appears, demanding new tests, new rituals, new answers. But there comes a moment, inevitable and sacred, when the seeker realizes that the very act of seeking has become his prison. This is the turning point, the instant when the gaze turns. It is not an intellectual gesture, nor an act of will. It is more like a gentle collapse of expectation. Something gives way inside, and the energy that once extended outward begins to withdraw, like a tide returning to its center. For the first time, the person notices that the question that had driven them so deeply did not need to be answered, only observed. It is an awakening without spectacle, a rebirth without trumpets. The mind, accustomed to building paths, resists. It fears silence. It fears the emptiness that opens when there are no goals to reach. That is why it tries to turn looking within into yet another task. It builds techniques, methods, meditations. But the true inner movement is too simple to be taught. It does not happen through effort, but through surrender. It is the moment one realizes there is nothing to attain, only something to recognize. Imagine a traveler who, after years of walking, decides to rest by the edge of a lake. He lies down, exhausted, and observes the still surface of the water. For the first time, he seeks nothing. He wants no answers, no visions. He simply observes. And in this simple act, something surprises him. The lake reflects everything: sky, mountains, clouds, light. What he had been searching for outside is entirely there, reflected in what had always been before his eyes. Clarity then comes not as a discovery, but as a remembrance. The weariness of seeking outside is, in truth, the call to return to the source. When the energy that fueled the search begins to dissolve, a different serenity arises. It is not passivity, but presence. The being realizes that it does not need to change the world to touch the real. It only needs to be awake to what already is. This realization does not eliminate questions, but changes the place from which they arise. Instead of being cries of lack, they become expressions of wonder. The seeker ceases to be a beggar for answers and becomes an observer of the mystery. It is at this point that awakening begins to show itself. It does not start with a ray of light, but with a small shift of attention. The focus, once directed outward, begins to rest upon the very experience of the moment. The distant sound, the beating of the body, the air touching the skin, all gain unprecedented vividness. The present reveals itself as a vast territory, and the mind for a moment falls silent. This silence is not the absence of thought, but the absence of conflict with what is. And when the gaze turns inward, something surprising happens. The inside and the outside cease to exist as opposites. What is observed within oneself is of the same nature as what is observed in the world. The separation was only a habit of the mind, a perceptual trick. Thus the seeker begins to recognize a new direction, which in truth is no direction at all. It is a lucid rest, a stillness that sees. To experience this return, only an instant of surrender is needed. Close your eyes and feel the movement of inhaling and exhaling. Do not try to control the breath, simply sense the natural flow that moves through you. Each inhalation is the world entering you. Each exhalation is you returning to the world. There is no boundary. This simple exercise is the living metaphor of awakening, the recognition that inside and outside are the same movement. Weariness, therefore, is not an enemy. It is the disguised master. It arrives when all answers have failed, when all searches have proved empty. It announces the beginning of something new, no longer based on pursuing what is missing, but on contemplating what is. The weary seeker is the being about to awaken, because only when effort is exhausted does true vision open. And in that silent instant, the gaze that once wandered through the world finally discovers the home that had always awaited it, the living presence of now. The human being has learned to confuse movement with meaning. From an early age, one is taught to pursue, to conquer, to accumulate, and to call it progress. When the soul begins to feel the discomfort of emptiness, the mind, impatient, translates that calling into a new task, to find something to fill it. Thus the search becomes a refined form of escape. The seeker believes he is walking toward truth, but in reality, he is fleeing from the silence that awaits him. He does not realize that his search is the very obstacle, the ceaseless movement that prevents the stillness where truth rests. This impulse to search is seductive because it gives a sense of control. To seek is to act. To act is to exist. As long as there is something to reach, the ego stays alive. It feels useful, necessary at the center of the story. But this movement is not freedom. It is dependency. It is the mind feeding itself like a flame consuming its own oxygen. The more it searches, the more it reinforces the belief that something is missing. And the more it believes something is missing, the farther it feels from what is already present. The illusion is subtle. The mind creates an image of what would be the perfect state. Enlightenment, peace, love, fulfillment. And that image becomes the new prison. The seeker begins to compare every moment to the ideal he imagines. Thus, he becomes blind to the real. Everything that does not fit his fantasy is dismissed as imperfect. He becomes a hunter of light, but his very expectation casts shadows. There is an ancient myth about a man who tried to capture the wind. He built nets, traps, and walls. He believed that if he could contain the wind, he would possess the power of nature. But the more he tried to trap the air, the more he wore himself out. Until one day, exhausted, he lay down and felt the breeze caress his skin. For the first time, he felt the wind without trying to possess it. And then he understood. What he had tried to capture was what had always surrounded him. The seeker is that man. He tries to capture the ineffable with mental structures, but the mystery cannot be contained. It can only be felt. The endless search is born from the fear of emptiness. The mind fears the space where nothing can be named. It fears silence because there it ceases to exist. And yet it is precisely in that space that the being finds rest. Emptiness is not absence, it is formless fullness. It is the invisible ground from which all experiences arise. But as long as man tries to fill it with answers, he becomes an exile from his own center. Observe how the modern world amplifies this illusion. Every click offers a promise. Every course promises awakening. Every theory suggests a new beginning. It is a spiral of movement without arrival. Technology, spirituality, consumption, all repeat the same narrative. You are not enough yet, but you can be if you seek a little more. This is the melody of the ego, and it lulls the consciousness to sleep. Awakening begins when one listens to the silence between those notes. There is a profound difference between seeking and perceiving. To seek is to project the gaze toward the horizon. To perceive is to open the eyes in the now. The first attitude is driven by time. It always depends on a not yet. The second is born of eternity because it requires nothing to change. When the being perceives, it is not going anywhere. It is simply recognizing what already is. But this simplicity is unbearable for the mind accustomed to complexities. That is why it tries to shape the ineffable, inventing methods to reach the state of non-seeking. It is search disguised as renunciation. The mind dresses itself in spirituality, but continues to operate under the same mechanism, I trying to reach something. The paradox is that the more it tries to stop seeking, the more it reinforces the seeker. The cycle continues until the effort itself is seen as absurd. At that point, the invitation to true emptiness arises, not the melancholy emptiness of lack, but the living space of presence. It is like a silent room after a long piece of music. At first, the silence feels uncomfortable, almost threatening, but gradually it becomes the very sound of existence. Everything essential manifests from it. The search was the noise that kept the being from hearing what had always sounded within. Try it for a moment. Close your eyes and observe the inner impulse to want to understand what is being said. See if you can notice the mental movement that tries to grasp the words. Realize that this impulse is the search itself in action. Now, without judgment, simply feel it dissolving. Let the silence between the sentences also be part of the experience. The emptiness that remains is not absence, it is pure awareness. The seeker only understands the illusion of the search when effort becomes transparent. He realizes that the desire to find something outside himself is the last disguise of separation. The emptiness he fears is, in truth, the place where the self dissolves and being awakens. That is why the great masters never offered definitive answers, they only pointed to silence. Emptiness is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of vision. When the search dissolves, the world does not disappear. It continues, but it loses the weight of necessity. Things become simple again, the sound of the wind, the warmth of the sun, the pulse of life. What was once a field of searching becomes a field of presence. Emptiness ceases to be a whole and becomes vastness. The mind at last bows, and the being rests in what has always been complete. The mind is an engineer of space. Its craft is to separate, compare, measure, organize. It creates gaps between what is and what could be, between now and later, between the self and the world. This ability built civilizations, maps, systems, languages, but it also raised invisible walls between being and reality itself. The paradox of the mind is that it wants to understand what by nature cannot be understood by it. Thus it manufactures an imaginary distance between the seeker and the found, between the observer and the observed. It is a distance that never existed, yet seems as real as the air we breathe. The mind, by its structure, always operates in time. It thinks in terms of before and after, cause and effect. This temporal nature makes pure presence seem unattainable to it. When something happens, the mind already turns it into memory. When something is about to come, it turns it into expectation. The present instant slips through its fingers like water, and while it tries to capture the now, it turns it into a concept, a now thought, not lived. This is how the abyss arises, the space between real life, which happens, and the idea of life, which the mind describes. This abyss is subtle, but it has governed human experience for centuries. It is the backdrop of every sense of lack. When someone says, "I feel like something is missing," they are describing the interval created by the mind between reality and the image it projects of what should be. This feeling of incompleteness is not a mistake. It is the very structure of thought at work. Thought can only operate through difference. It needs contrast to exist. Thus, the mind only feels alive as long as it keeps the game of distance going. But what happens when the observer begins to see this mechanism? When attention, instead of following the flow of comparisons, turns toward the one who compares, something extraordinary occurs. The space the mind creates between the I and the world begins to reveal itself as an illusion, not because it disappears physically, but because it becomes transparent. Perception expands and realizes that thought itself is a movement within the field of consciousness and not the other way around. The mind is not outside life observing it. It is one of the phenomena that happen within life. It is as if consciousness were an ocean and the mind a surface current. For centuries, humans believed themselves to be only this current, limited, anxious, in motion. But by observing the mind without confusing oneself with it, one discovers the depth that has always been there, still silent. The distance that seemed to separate the seeker from the sought dissolves. The ocean was never trying to reach itself. This recognition is not the result of reasoning. It is a direct, almost physical perception. The mind tries to understand it, but cannot, because to understand is to remain within the mechanism of distance. Seeing the mind in action without trying to stop it is the first flash of freedom. It is like watching a river run with no need to dam it. Pure observation breaks the spell of the stream of images. To feel this, only a simple experience is needed. Close your eyes and observe the next thought that arises. Do not try to prevent it, just notice it. It may be a word, a memory, an image. Now realize, the one noticing the thought is not the thought. There is something that sees. This instance that observes is silent, unchanging, and does not move with what appears. It is like the sky before the clouds. The mind creates passing forms, but the space that receives them remains. It is in this space that the real dwells. The distance the mind creates is, therefore, an illusion of perspective. It is the same as looking at the horizon and believing that the sky and the earth part along that far-off line. We walk there and discover the line disappears. The horizon is only an illusion created by sight, and the same happens with the mind. Not yet, and something is missing, are mental horizons. When one walks toward them with full attention, they fall apart. What remains is the simple fact of being. The mind, however, fears this dissolution. It survives on the distance it creates. Without the gap between subject and object, it has no function. Therefore, it resists, argues, creates new quests. Now I need to understand the mind. I need to practice presence. I need to observe better. But every attempt to improve observation is still the mind operating. True observation is not an action. It is a natural state that arises when effort ceases. When this clarity begins to dawn, the world seems to change its texture. Things once seen as external become intimate. There is no longer I seeing the tree, there is only seeing. Sound, light, body, space. Everything merges into the same event. The mind keeps functioning, but now as a tool, not as the center of experience. It serves consciousness, and not the other way around. At this point, something profoundly liberating happens. Life ceases to be a project and returns to being a living phenomenon. The need to achieve disappears, and the instant reveals itself as self-sufficient. What was distance becomes union. What was seeking becomes seeing. The seeker finally realizes there was never anything to traverse, only a mistake of perception created by a mind that confused the map with the territory. When this confusion dissolves, the present no longer needs to be reached. It is. There is a point in the journey when the whole structure of perception begins to invert. What previously seemed clear, I am the one who observes the world, starts to waver. The gaze that sought to understand the real is met with a disconcerting revelation. That which observes is also being observed. It is as if the center dissolved, and the subject who believed it saw the world realized it is just one more movement within what it sees. It is not an intellectual collapse, but a collapse of identity. The boundary between observer and observed becomes porous, and in the silence of this fusion, the mind loses its throne. For much of life, human consciousness is identified with the position of the observer. I see, I think, I feel. This formula creates the feeling of control, of authorship. But who is this I that observes? When we turn our gaze toward it, it slips away. It is like trying to see one's own eyes without a mirror. The observer cannot be found as an object. Everything that is seen is phenomenon, movement, form. The I that observes is never found because it is not a thing. It is the very act of seeing. The direct perception of this is awakening. The observer awakens not by accumulating knowledge, but because it realizes it has never been separate from what it observes. The one who looked at the world from the outside discovers it is also part of the scene. Seeing is not happening in someone. It is happening as the universe itself in a state of consciousness. This realization cannot be explained because the very act of explaining it already recreates the duality it dissolves. It is something felt, like the moment when ice becomes water. There is no abrupt transition, only the recognition that rigidity was never natural. Imagine a flame observing fire. As long as it believes itself separate, it tries to understand the totality that surrounds it. But the instant it realizes it is made of the same element, the search ceases. It no longer needs to understand fire, it only needs to be fire. So it is with consciousness. The observer awakens when it realizes it is of the same substance as the observed. The world is not outside us, it is the unfolding of the same consciousness that perceives. This inversion is at once serene and dizzying. The mind, accustomed to operating by contrasts, tries to resist. It asks, "But then, who am I?" This question echoes as a last attempt at the ego's survival, which fears disappearing in the ocean of what is. And, in a way, that is what occurs. The personal self, the one that believed it was the center, dissolves into the vastness of the impersonal being. The observer ceases to be an entity and becomes the very field of observation. This perception alters the texture of all things. The sound of a leaf in the wind, the murmur of the body breathing, everything is perceived as a single dance. The I and the world become different aspects of the same movement. The silence that arises from this is not the absence of noise, but the absence of resistance. Life begins to flow without the friction of separation. It is as if the entire universe were breathing along with the body. In this state, time loses its dominion. The awakened observer no longer lives according to the past or the future. It realizes that both are only forms of thought. What remains is the instant, and the instant has no center. It is total, complete, self-sustaining. The I was only a momentary interpretation of this flow. When the interpretation ceases, the flow remains. To experience this turn, only attentive observation is needed. Close your eyes and notice the feeling of being. Do not try to describe it. Simply recognize that there is awareness here now. Notice that it has no form, no limit, no age. Now, notice that everything that arises, sounds, thoughts, sensations, happens within this field. There is no observer separate from it. There is only consciousness witnessing itself through forms. This recognition is simple, but it changes everything. Many call this instant enlightenment, but it is only the natural sight when the veil of separation falls away. There is no attainment, only clarity. The consciousness that seemed limited to the body discovers its true nature, unlimited, present in everything. What was previously perceived as outside becomes intimately familiar, as if the entire world were breathing within the same chest. When the observer awakens, it realizes that life never needed to be observed. It has always been observation itself. Pure perception is the foundation of everything. There is no longer a someone trying to see. There is only seeing. This subtlety is liberating because it dissolves effort, tension, judgment. Reality no longer needs to be interpreted. It simply is, and that is enough. This state is not an escape from the world, but the most radical return to it. The awakened observer keeps walking, working, loving, but there is a new lightness in everything. Doing no longer arises from lack, but from fullness. Living ceases to be an attempt to reach something and becomes a celebration of what already is. Everything that moves is recognized as an expression of the unchanging. In the end, the awakening of the observer is the recognition that there have never been two, only the play of consciousness with itself. The I that sought, the world that was sought, and the act of seeking are a single thing seen from three different angles. When this perception settles, the drama of existence loses its weight and becomes pure dance. Life, once a sequence of searches and resistances, reveals itself as the universe's own silent gaze upon itself. The impulse to understand is a reflex of the mind, an attempt to translate the mystery into language. Since the dawn of consciousness, the human being has tried to decipher life as if it were a riddle. He analyzes, compares, names, and believes that understanding is the same as seeing. But truth does not reveal itself to the mind that analyzes. It reveals itself to the consciousness that observes without demanding meaning. The desire to understand is often the ego's last defense before the unknown. It fears silence, for silence dissolves its need to exist. The mind seeks safety in meanings. It believes that if it can name what it feels, it will be safe from uncertainty. Therefore, it turns the mystery into explanations. It calls the inexplicable energy, the invisible God, the unnameable consciousness. And yet, by naming, it loses contact with the real. The word is only a shadow of the experience. The explanation is the trace left by something that has already passed. Silence, on the other hand, is the only place where the real still breathes intact. When observation happens without the interference of the desire to understand, a different clarity arises. It is not the kind of clarity that can be described, but the kind felt in the body, like a living stillness. It is the moment when the gaze becomes transparent and the world effortlessly reveals itself. Truth was never hidden. It was only dazzled by the noise of interpretations. It is in this inner silence that everything begins to show itself as it truly is. Simple, vast, indescribable. Imagine the sky after a storm. The clouds move away, and the light, which never ceased to be there, shines again. The mind is the veil of clouds. Silence is the space where the light manifests. Nothing needs to be done for the sun to return. Only let the clouds move away by themselves. So it is with truth. It is not attained. It is perceived when effort ceases. The observer who learns to remain silent before what is discovers a new way of seeing. He does not try to interpret the event, nor choose what is good or bad. He simply witnesses. In this witnessing, the very movement of thought becomes visible. We see fear being born, growing, dissolving. We see desire appear, gleam, disappear. Consciousness realizes that everything that arises has the same destiny: to pass. Silence is the only thing that remains. This perception has a transformative power. When the mind no longer tries to understand the flow, it surrenders to its own transience. And paradoxically, it is at this moment that true understanding is born, not as thought, but as presence. One realizes that the meaning of life cannot be discovered because life has no one meaning. It is the very act of signifying. The desire to understand disappears, and what remains is a peace that does not depend on answers. Many confuse this silence with apathy, but it is the opposite. The living silence of observation is full of intensity. It is the gaze of the universe recognizing itself in each form. When thought ceases, perception widens. Colors seem sharper, sounds deeper, the air denser. It is not a change in the world, but in the quality of attention. The mind no longer filters the real, it lets it through. There comes a moment when the observer realizes that silence is not an experience to be achieved. It is the basis of all experiences. Everything that exists emerges from this field of stillness. Thoughts, emotions, sounds, movements, all are waves on the surface of something immensely calm. When this perception settles, the desire to control or understand life dissolves like mist. Silence demands no effort. It is only recognized. Try to feel this now. Close your eyes for a moment and just listen. Do not look for a specific sound. Let all sounds come, the distant, the near, the internal. Now notice there is a space that contains them all. This space is silent, even when sound is present. This is the same silence that contains your thoughts, your emotions, your history. It does not judge, does not react, does not move. It only observes. This is the living truth, prior to any understanding. What reveals itself in this silence cannot be possessed. It does not offer answers. It only dissolves the questions. The mind fears this state because in it the mind ceases to be necessary. But the being, upon recognizing it, feels an unprecedented freedom. It is not the freedom to choose, but the freedom of not needing to choose. The observer realizes that the universe moves by itself, and that it has always been this movement. Truth is like the reflection of the moon on water. When we try to grasp it, the surface stirs, and the reflection vanishes. Only when the water is still is the reflection perfect. So it is with the silence of observation. It does not capture, it only reflects. And in this reflection, what was sought reveals itself as the very observer. If this passage resonates with you, allow yourself a moment of pause before continuing. Breathe and feel the space between thoughts. It is in this interval that the real communicates. And if this perception touched you in some way, share it. Like this video as a gesture of conscious silence, and write in the comments the phrase, "I choose to see without understanding." May these words serve as a reminder that true seeing begins when the desire to understand grows quiet. There is a moment when seeking is exhausted. Not out of giving up, but out of revelation. The seeker discovers that their entire journey was driven by an invisible assumption, that there are two poles, one that seeks and another that is sought. This is the root of all duality, the secret engine of every inner conflict. But when consciousness begins to perceive the falseness of this separation, something silent collapses within. The movement of seeking, which once seemed vital, now reveals itself as unnecessary. The clarity of seeing occupies the space where effort once was. Duality is the lens through which the mind sees the world. It divides everything into opposites, light and shadow, good and evil, right and wrong, me and the other. This division creates the stage of the human drama. The spiritual seeker tries to escape this game by seeking the one, but the very search is part of the same game. It keeps the two alive. Seeking the one is to perpetuate duality, because for a seeker to exist, there must be something to be found. The collapse occurs when this is seen with total clarity. In that instant, seeking ceases not because it has reached an end, but because it is revealed to have been an illusory movement from the start. When duality collapses, perception becomes direct. There is no longer an intermediary between observer and observed, because both are the same field. It is as if the gaze stopped leaving one point to reach another. It becomes circular, self-sufficient. Seeing happens by itself, without intention, without direction. Consciousness simply shines. It is in this state that seeking loses meaning, because there is no more distance to travel. The mind tries to understand this dissolution, but its structure does not accommodate non-duality. It exists only in contrast. If there is no difference, it has no ground on which to operate. For this reason, the clarity of seeing is often accompanied by a feeling of emptiness or suspension. The ego tries to interpret, "I'm losing something," when in fact it is being freed from the compulsion to divide experience. The I and the other, the inside and the outside, the divine and the mundane, all merge into the same presence. This fusion does not eliminate the multiplicity of the world. It only reveals that all forms are expressions of the same essence. The sound of the rain and the pulse of the heart belong to the same vibrating field. The gaze that recognizes this no longer needs to compare, choose, or reject. It simply witnesses the play of polarities without clinging to any of them. It is the point where silence becomes active, rest becomes lucidity. Imagine a bird flying over the ocean. From above it sees the movement of the waves, now calm, now rough. But the ocean remains one. So it is with consciousness when seeking dissolves. It observes the tides of experiences without identifying with them. Seeing becomes a serene flight over the sea of existence. There is no longer any need to understand the wave, because one knows oneself to be the ocean itself. In this state of clarity, time loses the power to fragment experience. Past and future cease to be axes of orientation. Everything becomes present, not as a fixed point, but as a continuous field. Seeking always belongs to time. It needs a narrative. I haven't arrived yet. Seeing, on the other hand, is timeless. It does not happen in time. Time happens within it. When this perception stabilizes, fear disappears. There is nothing left to achieve, and therefore nothing to lose. It is natural for the mind to try to reconstruct duality after this glimpse. It creates new contrasts such as enlightenment and ignorance, awake and asleep. But true seeing does not take sides. It recognizes all movements as expressions of the same principle. Even ignorance itself is seen as part of the dance. Clarity does not eliminate the shadow. It includes it, and by including it, dissolves its separation. This collapse of duality is not a sudden event for everyone. Sometimes it insinuates itself in small moments of presence, the instant when the sound of rain silences thought, or when one gaze meets another and time ceases. In these moments, seeking naturally fades, and the being rests in pure perception. The secret is to recognize these intervals and not turn them into goals. Seeing is not something to be attained, it is something that has always been. If you want to feel this now, look around without seeking anything specific. See the shapes, the colors, the textures. Then, turn your gaze inward and notice the act of seeing. Is there any difference between the gaze and what is seen? Where does the observer end and the observed begin? If attention remains steady, the answer dissolves before it even arises. It is the collapse of duality happening in real time. At this point, silence becomes the only possible language. Seeing is prayer without words, chant without sound. It is the recognition that everything is made of the same invisible substance, vibrating at different rhythms. When seeking disappears, seeing reveals itself as love itself, not the love that desires, but the love that recognizes. It does not try to unite. It already is union. And so the seeker does not disappear because they have reached the end of their journey, but because they discover that they never left the point of origin. All that existed was the movement of consciousness looking at itself in mirrors of form and time. When seeking dissolves, only seeing remains, vast, luminous, indivisible. In this state, even silence smiles because it has finally been heard. Witnessing the mind is one of the simplest and at the same time most revolutionary gestures a human being can perform. It is a silent, almost invisible act, but one that inverts the entire structure of existence. Because up to that point, a person lives submissive to the stream of thoughts that runs through them, believing that what they think is who they are. They confuse themselves with the inner voice that comments on everything, judges everything, projects everything. But there is an instant when something within begins to observe this voice, and what was a prison becomes an opening. The power is not in silencing the mind, but in seeing it clearly. The mind is like a compulsive narrator. It needs to tell stories to keep itself alive. If there is no narrative, it feels threatened. It comments on the past, anticipates the future, interprets the present. It creates scenarios of success and failure, glory and regret, like a tireless screenwriter. And by identifying with these stories, the human being becomes a character in their own mental plot. They live reacting to words that arise within themselves as if they were real events. Witnessing the mind is the moment when this enchantment breaks. The observer awakens and realizes, there are thoughts happening, but I am not them. This realization changes everything because it shifts the center of gravity of experience. The I ceases to be in the content and comes to be in the consciousness that contains it. Thought continues to exist, but it no longer rules. It becomes like the sound of the wind, something that is noticed, but does not need to be followed. When this lucidity begins to stabilize, the mind loses the power to wound. Emotions, once dominated by thoughts, come to be seen as natural movements of vital energy. Fear arises, is noticed, and dissipates. Anger appears, is recognized, and transforms. Nothing needs to be repressed, because nothing threatens identity anymore. The being that observes knows that everything that appears is fleeting, and that the space of consciousness is larger than any content. This shift is profoundly liberating. Before, the individual lived inside mental noise, trying to find silence through control, controlling thoughts, words, behaviors. But control is just another name for resistance, and all resistance strengthens what it tries to eliminate. When the observer is established, there is no longer a struggle. The mind is seen in its nature, impermanent, conditioned, repetitive, and upon being seen, it begins to calm down. Thought cannot withstand the light of conscious attention for long. It dissolves like mist under the sun. True transformation occurs when one realizes that the observer and the mind are not enemies. The mind is a tool, not a tyrant. It only became oppressive because the being believed it depended on it to exist. When observation becomes constant, the mind begins to find its natural place. It comes to serve and no longer to command. It organizes, translates, communicates. but it no longer defines what is real. The center of experience returns to silence. This new inner posture is not indifference. On the contrary, it is radical presence. Witnessing does not distance itself from life, it deepens it. When there is no identification, the gaze becomes compassionate. The suffering of others is felt with empathy, but without the weight of despair. Joy is lived fully, without fear of loss. Love ceases to be dependency and becomes transparency. Everything becomes an extension of the same field of consciousness. There is a metaphor that describes this state well. Imagine a stage where many scenes take place: dramas, comedies, tragedies. The lights change, the actors come and go, emotions alternate. The audience reacts, cries, laughs, gets involved. But there is something that never changes: the space of the stage. It welcomes all the stories but belongs to none. Witnessing the mind is to recognize oneself as that stage, unchanging, silent, broad enough to contain everything without getting lost in anything. In practice, this perception can begin in a simple way. Sit in silence and notice the flow of thoughts. Instead of following each one, just watch their movement. Notice how they arise spontaneously, without your decision. Observe how they dissolve on their own. Little by little, this observation reveals that there is no thinker controlling the process. There is only thought happening, and there is something deeper, the space that sees it happen. That space is you. As consciousness anchors itself in this witnessing, reality becomes lighter. External situations continue, but they no longer touch the center of being. Emotions come and go, but they no longer carry the weight of an identity. Fear may still appear, but it is perceived as a movement within a larger field, and therefore loses its power. This is how the awakened observer begins to live, in serenity, even in the midst of chaos. The mind may try to claim this experience as a personal achievement, but true witnessing is devoid of ownership. It belongs to no one. It simply is. When this silent presence becomes familiar, the whole world seems to change frequency. The everyday, once full of invisible tensions, reveals itself permeated with stillness. Sound, gesture, breath, everything vibrates within the same silence that observes. To live as a witness to the mind is to live free. It is to walk within one's own thought without getting lost in it. It is to allow life to happen without the incessant filter of interpretation. It is to return to the point where everything is born, the gaze that sees but does not blend. This is the deepest transformation, not changing the content of the mind, but realizing that you were never the content. When this clarity blossoms, the world no longer needs to be fixed, only contemplated. The awakened being does not flee from the mind, nor fight it. They welcome it as part of the great movement of consciousness, and in this acceptance, the miracle happens. The mind becomes silent out of gratitude. It understands that, at last, it has been seen. Attention is the most subtle instrument of transformation that exists. It is not a tool invented by man, but the very expression of his consciousness. It has always been there, silent, sustaining every act of seeing, feeling, and thinking. Yet most people live with fragmented attention, scattered among memories and projections, distracted by the mental noise the mind produces endlessly. When that attention gathers and rests in the present moment, something profound happens. Reality, which has always been there, begins to reveal itself in layers. It is as if invisible doors open to dimensions that are not new, but were dormant through the absence of presence. The first portal that opens is that of sharpness. When attention becomes full, the world gains an almost supernatural clarity. Colors seem more vivid, sounds more defined, movements slower and more precise. But it is not the world that has changed. It is perception that has been purified. The mind, which once interfered with comparisons and judgments, falls silent, allowing the experience to reveal itself in its totality. The simple act of observing a flame, a leaf in the wind, or the rhythm of breathing becomes an experience of completeness. Attention, when total, transforms the ordinary into the sacred. The second portal is that of interconnection. Mindful attention reveals that nothing exists in isolation. Everything that manifests is intrinsically linked to everything else. The air that enters the lungs is the same that has passed through forests and seas. The food that sustains the body carries the invisible work of the earth and the light. Even a simple thought is part of a current of energy that flows through generations. This perception is not intellectual, it is sensory, almost physical. The observer feels life as a pulsing web of which they are not the center, but one vibration among others. And this awareness of interconnection dissolves the sense of loneliness that accompanies the separate mind. The third portal is that of timelessness. When attention rests fully in the now, psychological time dissolves. The past ceases to be a burden and the future loses its anxiety. There is only the living presence of the moment, and in this state there is no haste, no waiting. Everything becomes simultaneous. It is as if time bends before the immensity of the present moment. This perception is liberating because it reveals that being was never trapped by chronology, it only believed it was. Life reveals itself as a continuous flow, and the observer begins to dance within it, naturally and lightly. But perhaps the deepest portal is that of transparency. When attention is full, the I that observes begins to disappear. The gaze becomes so free of intention that the observer dissolves into the observed. It is the instant when the flower is no longer a flower, nor the wind merely wind. Both are the very manifestation of consciousness in form. Subject and object merge. There is no longer the act of seeing, there is only seeing. This fusion is the heart of what is called awakening. Attention, purified of desire and fear, reveals that the world and being are one movement, one breath. There is, however, a subtle aspect to this practice. Mindful attention is not effort. It does not arise from discipline but from surrender. Effort belongs to the mind that tries to control, and control is the opposite of true attention. Genuine attention is relaxed, open, receptive. It observes without wanting to change anything, and it is precisely because it does not want to change that everything transforms. When consciousness looks without resistance, the energy that was trapped spontaneously reorganizes itself. Presence heals because it does not fight, it simply illuminates. To experience this transformation, only an instant of stillness is needed. Sit or stand, but be completely awake. Bring attention to the body and feel the contact of your feet with the ground. Feel the weight, the temperature, the flow of air entering and leaving. Do not name, just feel. Now expand this perception. Listen to the sounds around you. Feel the rhythm of breathing. Notice the thoughts that arise and pass. In a few moments, you will notice something surprising. There is a field of consciousness that sustains all of this, and it is silent. This field is what has always been present but is rarely noticed. When attention rests in it, the portals of perception open. This opening is not an escape from the world, but a deeper immersion in it. Mindful attention reveals the hidden dimension of the everyday. The gaze upon a beloved face becomes a cosmic experience. The simple act of washing one's hands turns into meditation. The sacred ceases to be sought in temples or scriptures and begins to pulse in every gesture, in every detail of existence. Living becomes a ritual, not because there are rules, but because there is presence. And gradually, the one who observes realizes that it is not they who are opening portals. It is consciousness itself that through them recognizes itself. This revelation brings a deep humility. The seeker bows before the vastness of what observes them from within. Mindful attention at that point is no longer a practice but a natural state. Being ceases to pay attention and becomes attention itself. When this happens, life transforms in a subtle but irreversible way. Automatic reactions disappear, haste loses its meaning, and love ceases to be an intermittent feeling to become the foundation of all perception. To see is to love. To observe is to participate in creation. Mindful attention is the portal that leads the being back to the heart of the real, not a new place, but the rediscovery of the place where it has always been. When seeking ceases, the gaze matures. Everything that once seemed distant reveals itself as intimate, as if the world finally breathed in unison with the heart. The mind may try to regain control, but it is already too late. Seeing has settled. There is no possible return after touching the silence that observes everything effortlessly. In this state, life ceases to be a labyrinth and becomes an open field, vast, still, luminous. The seeker disappears, and being remains, whole, transparent, present. If you felt this living presence throughout the video, write in the comments, "I see what has always been here." And if you wish to continue diving into these spaces of perception and consciousness, subscribe. The journey does not end. It only changes direction, from the outside to the inside.